along the River Ottery at the heart of East Devon, this is Radio Ottery.
Hello, I'm Philip Algar and I live in West Hill. I must thank all those who've participated in this fascinating project, and I really do hope that Radio Ottery will prove to be very successful in attracting regular listeners and of course local presenters who can tell us more about their own lives and the community in which we live. For many years I was a freelance journalist and occasional broadcaster. I participated in discussions on radio and television and was an interviewee on hundreds of occasions, talking about energy, economics and international politics. I was fortunate in meeting many famous broadcasters, albeit just for a few minutes at a time. Now I write books, and my latest, which is supposed to be humorous, is the second of two, which tells how a village is confronted by corrupt local government, big business and a spiteful Whitehall, which wants to change the character of the village forever. However, today I want to talk about some of the odd or even funny incidents that have occurred in the press or during some of my broadcasts. I want to start by just telling you of some funny headlines, and I can assure you that they're all genuine. One I particularly like: judges to rule on nude beach. Another one: 6 held over Madrid bomb. Then of course there was one during the war: General MacArthur flies back to front. More recently perhaps, in the USSR as it was then, Khrushchev finishes second in first ever game of golf. That was against the American President Dwight Eisenhower. Another one, more recently: fed up dinner lady quits. Another one, believe this or believe it not: dog injures nose. And two that I particularly like: dead man found in graveyard, woman found in Germany. And to me, as an old hack, it makes me wonder if anybody ever actually looks at what they've written and tries to see any ambiguity. Fortunately for us and this programme, they obviously don't. I want to start by just telling you of things that can go wrong in one interview. Some years ago I was about to interview the boss of a medium-sized oil company. He had a reputation for being thoroughly bad-tempered, and I was ready for him, but not in the way that I expected. I decided, as always, to take my tape recorder, and I put new batteries in. And of course it was just my foul luck that the machine turned itself on in my long journey up to London, and by the time I was ready to start the interview, the batteries were totally dead. He didn't seem to mind, and I apologised obviously and went out and bought some new batteries. However, the score was to be even, because as I sat down, the chair, which seemed to be sufficiently capable of sustaining my weight, collapsed, and I fell on the floor. So I felt there was 1-1, and after that the ice was broken, as it were, and we did a very good interview. One of the problems of press conferences, though, is that those who organise the press conference occasionally fail to understand the needs of the media and how they should react to the media. Let me tell you of a real story just after the Falklands War. To avoid shaming anyone or even the possibility of legal action, I'll leave names out. But let's just say that it was a large company who stood to gain by building up some of the armaments that we'd lost during the Falklands War. The questioning was getting increasingly difficult, and clearly the company hadn't really prepared properly for the press. And one friend of mine was getting very close to uncovering something which I suspect the organisers of the conference didn't want uncovered. Suddenly, without any warning, the chief executive of the company looked at his watch, said, "Good Lord, it's 12:30, time for lunch," and walked out. Of course, when you undertake a press conference, if you're management, you always say, right, we've got 1 hour for questions, so that it doesn't look cowardly if you run away. He ran away. And I needn't tell you what sort of headlines he got the following day. But there are other ways of insulting journalists. There was a small oil company with a very agreeable chief executive who had a wry sense of humour, but sometimes it backfired. He'd organised a press conference and the the might of Fleet Street was gathered, plus me, and he said, "I'm only giving you dry biscuits, because if I give you anything else, you'll make a mess on my new carpet." Well, those of us who knew him quite well understood this and smiled dutifully. Others, understandably, were very put out. But out of many press conferences that I attended over the years, I think one that I particularly enjoyed was when a friend of mine who worked for one of the national papers, a quality paper, and many of us were at a conference organised by what was then the National Coal Board. And perhaps I should explain that this was to assess and comment on the results, the financial results of the National Coal Board for the previous year. And on those sort of occasions, the media are always given just 20 minutes possibly to flick through the annual accounts and come up with questions and posers for the assembled might of the board. And of course, any company that is involved in a situation like this really must do its homework and anticipate what sort of questions are we going to be asked and how can we cope with them when they come. Never be caught out. It didn't happen on this occasion. This friend of mine flicked through the results and said, "I see that the remuneration of the board has gone up by," I forget the percentage, but it was a very significant percentage. He continued, "How is it that at a time of economic stringency you feel that the board is justified in having such massive increases in their remuneration?" The chairman hadn't anticipated this, nor indeed had his colleagues, and mayhem broke out briefly, with individuals saying, "Well, I didn't have an increase. No, I didn't. Well, I only had 5%. And at last, the chairman regained control and said, "Let me explain." He'd eventually come to the conclusion, the right conclusion, that the number of people on the board had been increased. But you won't be surprised that a lot of credibility had gone. Then there was an extremely embarrassing but humorous press conference. Again, I'll leave names out, partly because I don't want to be sued, but let's just say it was a Secretary of State, and the press conference took place in London, and I asked a straightforward question, and the answer was, believe this or believe it not, no comment. Well, you never say no comment. It arouses the curiosity and possibly antagonism of the audience. And I said, "Well, that's very interesting." And the Secretary of State, who shall remain nameless, then said, "Oh, you shouldn't read too much into that." Well, talk about having dug a hole and then falling further into it. My response, predictably, "Well, that's even more interesting." At which time this Secretary of State was laughed at loud and long by about 40 journalists. But press conferences can go wrong for other reasons. This time it was a Minister of State, not a Secretary of State. And I asked a question. It wasn't a trick question, it wasn't a clever question, it wasn't designed to make the Minister look an idiot. He managed that by himself. And at that time I worked as a freelance for a number of different publications. And I put my question to him. And he puffed and went red in the face and was clearly under some torment. And eventually his civil servant came to the rescue and gave him an answer. Afterwards, the minister came over to me, even redder in the face, and said, wagging a finger under my nose, never again ask a question like that when there are foreign journalists present in the room." Well, I was, to put it mildly, surprised. And I said, "Well, as it happens, I work currently for Norwegian, American and British papers. Which part of me should I censor? And by the way, Minister, I thought this was a democracy and this was a press conference." And we left, as you can gather, on rather sour terms. I then went back to London. This press conference was held in Aberdeen. And on the plane on the way back, I became increasingly angry at the way that I'd been treated. And indeed, some of my friends in the press reported this, though mercifully they didn't name me, because that could have been embarrassing. And I decided by the Monday morning I would ring the department and say I wanted to see the Minister and have it out with him. Why should I be insulted in that way, doing my job, I hope, professionally? To my astonishment, when I phoned the department, they said, "Ah, yes, the Minister wants to see you." Curiouser and curiouser. I turned up expecting a fierce battle. Instead of that, I was offered a cup of tea and some neatly cut cucumber sandwiches. And without any further ado, the Minister said, I want to know who asked you to ask that question. I said, I conjured it up for myself, Minister. If anyone asked me to put a question to you, I wouldn't. That goes against my beliefs. And what emerged was that the department had split down the line, split down the middle, as it were. Some people were in favour of X, some people were in favour of Y. And the Minister had perceived, understandably, that they'd nobbled me in order to get to him. I assured him that wasn't the case. And thereafter the Minister and I became very friendly indeed. And in fact, on many occasions when I met him subsequently, and this is not this is a confession, not a boast, he used to ignore his civil servants and say, "Go away, I'm still talking to Philip, we haven't finished our conversation," all of which was very flattering. And for many years I even had a Christmas card from him. How lucky can you get? Sometimes, though, press conferences can be turned into something reasonably amusing, providing you know the people involved. On one occasion I was at a press conference in Houston, and I knew the chairman and the only other speaker at the press conference. And the chairman announced, "Right, I will pass on all the technical questions to my colleague here, and I will just deal with the simple ones." And guess what? Every single question was deemed to be technical, and the chairman hadn't answered any questions at all. I thought, this is getting farcical, let's have a bit of fun. And if anything, I was always slightly irresponsible at press conferences, I have to admit. So I said to him, "Chairman, can you tell me which city we're in?" And that really floored him, and of course there were guffaws of laughter from my colleagues, amused by my puerile sense of humour, and eventually he reacted. But as I must stress, I knew him, I knew the journalist, and I knew the other speaker, and it was relatively safe.
Of course, sometimes press conferences take place, they say, at a site meeting. And there was one famous occasion a press conference had been convened somewhere in Kent many, many years ago, and a company had built, or was about to build, I forget which now, a new drilling rig to look for oil onshore UK. And they'd organised coachloads of journalists, television and radio, as well as press, to turn up. Unfortunately for them, that particular day coincided with an enormous invasion of small flies. There must have been millions of these flies. And in a sense, I suppose, the organisers of the conference and the site meeting should have been very happy. It made the headlines on television news that evening, with literally dozens of journalists scratching their heads, fishing small flies out of their eyes, and nobody in the media, especially television, mentioned why we were there in the first place. Flies invade from France was the sort of attitude. As far as television and radio are concerned, I think we're very, very fortunate in this country in having so many very professional professionals, and the audience so often doesn't see what goes wrong just behind the scenes, and what can go wrong. My first interview, and again let me stress, I only did 3-4 minute interviews of the occasional discussion, but I'm not in any way suggesting I was a regular television person. But my first interview was in the street. Now, I've always been opposed to street interviews, particularly after the one I'm going to mention now. It was not only in the street, it was a busy London street. Trucks and buses were zooming past, chucking out fumes, also making a large noise. And it was also opposite a hospital, and the N of the word nose had come off, so it was the O's, ears and throat hospital, which made me smile anyway, but I managed to restrain the smile, and the interview started just as a truck was going past, and I was supposed to be commenting on the state of the national economy. However, things got worse. There were 2 old ladies going past. One said to the other, "Who's he?" And the other one said, "Never seen him in me life. Can't be famous, don't recognise him." And when you're just about to explain what you think is happening to the UK economy, that can really put you off. But you can be put off in the studio, other things that go wrong, and usually are covered up by the technical people. I was doing an interview on one occasion with John Donne, who listeners may remember was 6 foot plus. And therefore I was sitting on what I call a typist chair, which had been yanked up so that the microphone was roughly parallel with John Donne, who was sitting on an ordinary chair, and me sitting in my elevated position. The interview had been going strong for a few minutes, and I suddenly realised that my chair, the typist chair, was spinning down, and I was heading towards the ground at a fair rate of knots. This presented me with an immediate question. Do I increase my own volume, or will the guys in the production booth do it for me? And I sort of compromised, whether it worked or not I don't know. I increased my volume a bit, so did the production guys. But there are other bizarre incidents that can occur. There was one occasion when I'd been asked to go in and talk on a chat show that was interspersed with music on the Radio 2. And the presenter of the programme, I wouldn't name him, it was Jimmy Young, a consummate professional. And he always made you feel at home by saying, call me Jimmy right away, so you felt it was a friendly relationship. And he said to me, we may be interrupting the programme to go over to Moscow for the funeral of some leading politician, I forget which one. Now, I assumed, therefore, that my interview might be 3 minutes or 30 seconds, depending on what was happening in Moscow. However, I got it wrong, because suddenly, in the middle of the interview, Jimmy Young padded out of the studio without a word, very quietly, and left me live on air. Well, I'd like to think it was a great compliment. I carried on talking. He padded back a few moments later, gave me a thumbs-up signal, and the programme continued. But mercifully, I wasn't shaken by it, otherwise it could have been very serious. But of course, there can also be misunderstandings. And in the old days, and I'm not sure if it's true now, interviewees had to be made up. And I was being made up, sitting alongside a famous female presenter, and she turned to me and said, is it all right if my first question is, do you think it's reasonable for children to be allowed walking near a cliff on an organised outing without adult supervision? Well, this was a loaded question anyway, because some children sadly have recently lost their lives. And I said, and bear in mind this is still in the makeup room, I said, well, I'm more than happy to comment on that and take it as my first question, but I am here actually to discuss the budget. And things like that can go seriously wrong. There was one occasion, nothing to do with me, I hasten to add. I gathered from one of my friends on the inside of the beam. It had been an accident at an underground station, and a man was being interviewed because he was an expert on the underground. And after a short while, this man said, and this, bear in mind, was live, I really don't know why you're asking me these questions. And the presenter, a consummate professional, said, well, I understand you to be an expert on the underground. He said, yes, underground art and culture, not railways. And that sort of thing can happen. And if you've got a sense of humour and you're appearing on a semi-serious programme, that too can be quite embarrassing if you let it go. I'm going to name the lady now because I was very proud to have done a few interviews with her, Selina Scott. And breakfast television was in its relative infancy, and I was asked to turn up occasionally and perform with interviews. And the first time that I appeared with Selina Scott, she welcomed me into the studio and made me feel very much at home. And before the cameras went live, she said, how long have you been in journalism then, Philip? And I did a quick sum and worked it out and said, such and such. And she then looked at me as if I was the only male in the world that mattered to her at all, and said, you certainly don't look at that sort of age. I think I was perhaps in my mid-30s. And I didn't really know how to react to this supreme compliment from such a glamorous lady. So in the manner of Laurel and Hardy, I just rolled up my tie and pulled a funny face. And that seemed to do the trick. Then the red light came on the camera. And you can guess, of course, what our opening line was. I understand, Philip, that you've been involved with journalism for X years. You really don't look like it. Oh, you're wearing very well, some sort of compliment. And I suddenly thought, God, do I roll up my tie like Laurel and Hardy? And I just muttered very British, well, thank you very much. And so the interview continued. Of course, other things can backfire. And there was one occasion when, inevitably, petrol prices had gone up. And I was being interviewed by a BBC journalist who's still with the Beat, some decades on. And my first question was, who should we blame for this latest rise in prices? And obviously I was expected to say the wicked oil companies, the fleece us at the pumps, have no regard for this and that and so on. But the reality was the latest increase had been caused by the government. They'd increased the duty yet again. And I said, well, I'm not saying that they should be blamed for the increase, because there are lots of factors involved, but in fact we ought to bear in mind that the government takes, I think it was then 65% of what we pay at the pump, and the latest increase pushes it up to 70% or whatever the figures were. This was a recorded interview, and she immediately said, "Stop, stop," and the recording stopped. She then turned to me looking very angry and said more or less, "Please take this seriously. I want a serious answer." I said, "I have given you a serious answer. Those are the facts." And the interview started all over again. But she still didn't believe me, because the next man on this program was the boss or managing director of one of the leading oil companies. I was going to say in the UK, it was a global company. Her first question to him was, "I understand that the rate of duty is the main cause of the latest increase, and it's now about 70%, or whatever figure I quoted." And mercifully he said, "Yes, that's absolutely right." So I was vindicated, and subsequently asked to go back from time to time to do interviews with the same journalist. One subject that I always used to dread, but I did turn up occasionally, because it was all good experience, was the phone-in. And you get some very peculiar people ringing up on some phone-ins. And I was doing a phone-in, and I will name the lady, because she was very professional in the way that she handled a potential problem. It was Carol Thatcher, and the programme was on LBC in London. And I was to answer questions on energy, and I'd done my homework and felt reasonably confident. And what was always irritating, of course, was that the caller rings in, announces himself, says, "Good afternoon," etc. Then it's "Good afternoon, Miss Thatcher," "Good afternoon, Mr. Bloggs," "Good afternoon, Mr. Algar," so it goes on. And you feel like saying, "Get on with the question, what are you on about?" Well, this man, and I still don't know who it was, it may well have been a friend with a warped sense of humour, said, "My neighbour has a three-legged dog." Carol Thatcher looked at the control unit in the middle of the studio and started putting very justified faces at him. And he then, before Carol Thatcher could react, said, "I do have permission from my neighbour who lives in Twickenham to mention his three-legged dog." At which point Thatcher was pulling even more faces, again fully justified. He said, "Mr. Bloggs of Twickenham, please can I have your question?" And he made some further comment about this wretched animal. And as far as my memory takes me, because this was a long time ago, he was then given a warning to come out with his question. And he came out with an absolute blockbuster, which convinced me I was being set up. And it was a question about some tidal scheme to extract energy from waves, wave power. But fortunately I knew about 3 paragraphs worth of the subject, so I spread it out, and that was the end of him. But it was very easy to come a cropper with interviews. It may be difficult to understand or accept, but sometimes questions to an interviewee are so complicated you don't really know what the interviewer is talking about. But if you don't know the subject matter, it's obviously perfectly reasonable to say, "I'm sorry, could you explain what you mean by so-and-so?" But sometimes a question, and I'm thinking of Russell Harty, who was well known some years ago. The trouble was his opening question contained so many negatives, you didn't know if the answer was yes or no. And I worked this out, fortunately, before I was interviewed by him, and I decided whatever his first question was going to be, I was going to say what I wanted to say. And that, incidentally, is a good way of tackling any sort of interview. There was another occasion when LBC, there was an afternoon discussion programme, news items and so on, which was very, very good indeed, and again I'm going back some decades. And I'd been invited to turn up. And I looked at the studio clock, the second hand was whizzing round, second by second, at 3 o'clock when we went live, the presenter wasn't there. With just a few seconds to go, I thought, fame at last, pass me the script, I'll present this programme, and I'll wing it, as they say. At the very last moment, the door opened, and the presenter, who was presentable as well, young lady, catapulted herself from the door of the studio into the chair alongside me, and puffing said, "Good afternoon, welcome to..." And then I was introduced and away we went. And at the end of the programme, I said, "What on earth happened? It's not like you to be late." And she actually said, "I was locked in the loo." I said to my father that evening, because he was always a very loyal supporter and listened to anything I did, "What do you think of the broadcast this afternoon?" He said, "Well, it was very strange. That girl seemed to be out of breath. What was going on?" Whether he actually accepted what I told him was the truth, I don't know. I mentioned makeup earlier. There was another problem. At the end of the broadcast, you're obviously given a towel or something like that, or have a wash to get rid of the makeup, which was quite heavy in those distant days. And my next port of call after doing a television interview on this occasion was to go to the House of Commons to report on the meeting of the Select Committee. So I disappeared into the loo, wiped the makeup off, rushed out to go to the House of Commons. When I got there, I decided that I was so hot that I was running, the second wash was justified. But I looked in the mirror, and I looked a little like L. Jolson in reverse. My face, despite my efforts, was still covered in makeup. Well, fortunately, at that stage I hadn't appeared with the Select Committee and my colleagues. I was mentioning this to an old friend of mine who worked for Fleet Street National, and he said exactly the same thing happened to him. He'd wiped the makeup off, or so he thought. But unfortunately, his next engagement was to have some drink with some friends in, of all places, a Glasgow pub, and he turned up with all this makeup on, and I think he lost quite a few friends on that occasion. I just want to end by giving you one or two more headlines. One I particularly like, which I believe comes from a local paper. Police chiefs said that alcohol was to blame for dozens of drink-related accidents in Exeter. I'm assured that's true. There's another one. Volunteers at a Worcester charity shop walked out after their manager was suspended over a poster hanging in the window. That should bring the customers in. So thank you very much for listening, and I wish Radio Ottery all the very best. Thank you.
Broadcasting along the River Otter and at the heart of East Devon. This is Radio Ottery.